Today we're talking about something that I think deserves a lot more nuance than it usually gets. Because when people say BTS paved the way, it tends to either get met with overwhelming agreement from one corner of the internet, or eye rolls and stop being dramatic from another. And I think both of those reactions are actually missing what's really happening, what has been happening in real time across the last decade of the global music industry. So today, we're not arguing about whether BTS paved the way. We're going to look at how. Specifically, how a group getting dragged, dismissed, gatekept, and scrutinized at every single turn ended up doing more for the international expansion of Korean music than any marketing campaign, any label strategy, or any industry relationship ever could have. Because here's the thing nobody really talks about. The path doesn't get paved by the people who are celebrated. It gets paved by the people who take the hits first. To understand what BTS actually built, you have to go back to what the landscape looked like before they broke through in the West. And I mean really broke through, not has a dedicated international fan base broke through, but is being discussed on American morning television broke through. Before that moment, K-pop had a ceiling. Psy cracked it open briefly with Gangnam Style in 2012, but that was treated as a novelty, a viral moment, something to laugh at and move on from. The Western industry watched it happen, filed it under quirky internet thing, and kept it moving. The assumption baked into the entire Western music establishment was that music not sung primarily in English had a hard cap on how far it could travel. You could be internationally beloved within Asian markets, you could have passionate pockets of fans in Europe and the Americas, but the mainstream, the Billboard Hot 100, the arena circuit in North America, that was not considered realistic. That ceiling felt permanent. BTS didn't just bump up against that ceiling. They headbutted it repeatedly for years until it cracked. And then they walked through it. And the walking through part is important because that's where the paving actually happens. Not in the triumphant moment, but in all the painful, unglamorous ones that came before it. Think about what the early years of BTS's Western push actually looked like. Because it wasn't glamorous. It was a smaller label with a fraction of the resources of S&M or YG, going up against an industry that had no infrastructure, no template, and no real interest in making space for them. They did interviews where the hosts barely knew their names. They sat on American talk show couches where the energy was politely condescending, like the hosts were doing them a favor by having them on. They won the Billboard Music Award for Top Social Artist in 2017, and instead of being celebrated, the immediate conversation was about whether that category even counted, whether they even counted. They had to fight for legitimacy at every single step. And here's why that matters for every group that came after them. By the time BTS had that fight, by the time they had absorbed years of, is this real popularity and do they deserve to be here discourse, those questions were largely exhausted by the time the next wave arrived. When Blackpink started making serious inroads in the Western market, nobody was asking whether K-pop belonged on Western stages. That question had already been beaten to death and answered. BTS answered it. When Stray Kids, ATEEZ, 17 started filling arenas in North America and Europe, the industry infrastructure was already there. The concert promoters who understood how to market these tours, the streaming platforms that had already built out their K-pop categories, the media outlets that had already hired writers who understood the genre. None of that existed before BTS forced it into existence. And here's something I want to sit with for a second, because I think it gets glossed over. The infrastructure that exists now for K-pop in the West, the playlists, the editorial support on streaming platforms, The dedicated radio segments, the magazine coverage, the red carpet invitations. None of that was given. It was negotiated. It was demanded. And BTS, specifically ARMY, were the ones doing the demanding. When ARMY flooded streaming platforms with listens, when they organized voting campaigns, when they made it impossible for Billboard or Spotify or the Grammys to pretend Korean artists weren't a commercial force, they were doing something that benefited every K-pop artist who would ever come after. Every time ARMY trended something worldwide, every time a BTS album debuted at #1 and couldn't be ignored, it sent a message to the industry. There is money here. There is an audience here. Build the infrastructure or get left behind. And the industry, because the industry follows money, built the infrastructure. So when a newer group now has their album featured on Spotify's front page, when they get invited to perform at a major American awards show, when a late-night host actually knows their names and does their homework before the interview, that is a direct inheritance from what BTS and ARMY spent years forcing into existence. But it goes deeper than infrastructure, because BTS didn't just open doors. They changed what Western audiences were willing to accept. Before BTS, there was a very firm idea in the Western pop consciousness about what a male pop star was supposed to look like, sound like, and perform like. The masculinity was supposed to be a specific kind. The fashion was supposed to be a specific kind. The emotional range was supposed to be contained within very specific limits. And then 7 Korean men showed up, in jewelry and eyeliner, dancing in perfect synchronization, talking openly about mental health and vulnerability and self-love, and doing all of it with an artistic seriousness that couldn't be dismissed, even by people who wanted to dismiss it. That was disorienting for a lot of Western audiences. And because it was disorienting, it attracted a lot of drag. A lot of criticism that was actually just discomfort with something that didn't fit the box. But here's what that discomfort produced over time. A widened box. A recalibrated idea of what was acceptable, desirable, even aspirational in a male pop act. By the time fourth-generation K-pop groups started pushing into the Western market, presenting the same kind of aesthetic, the same fluidity, the same emotional openness, the same performance precision, it wasn't nearly as shocking. Audiences had already had years of engagement with BTS recalibrating their expectations. The ground had been softened. I want to talk about the military because it's impossible to talk about what BTS has built without talking about what it cost them. In South Korea, mandatory military service is a reality for male citizens. For years, there was a public debate about whether BTS, as arguably the most economically impactful cultural export South Korea had ever produced, should receive an exemption similar to what Korean Olympic athletes and classical musicians receive. It was a genuinely complicated national conversation with real political dimensions, real economic stakes, and real feelings on every side. They didn't get the exemption. The members enlisted. And they did it without bitterness, without making it a bigger spectacle than it needed to be, which is, if you think about it, a very BTS way of handling something enormous. But here's what that moment did for the K-pop industry more broadly. It clarified, once and for all, how the South Korean government and establishment actually values its cultural exports. The conversations that happened in the Korean National Assembly, in economic policy discussions, in cultural ministry deliberations, were conversations about the financial and soft power value of K-pop acts as a category, not just BTS, the category. The policy conversations, the legislation that eventually allowed for postponement, the ongoing discussions about how Korea manages its biggest cultural ambassadors, all of it was forced into the open because of BTS. Groups who come after them will navigate a policy landscape that has at least been examined, even if imperfectly, because BTS made it impossible not to examine it. Here's something else I think about a lot: the language barrier. For decades, the conventional wisdom in the Western music industry was simple. If you want to succeed internationally, sing in English. Full stop. It was presented as a practical reality, not a preference. You want airplay? English. You want editorial support? English. You want to be taken seriously by Western media? English. BTS challenged that in the most direct way possible, by succeeding without following that rule. Yes, they released English-language singles, but their Korean-language albums debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. Their Korean-language songs became cultural touchstones for millions of people who don't speak a word of Korean. They proved that emotional connection transcends language in a way that the industry had convinced itself wasn't commercially viable. And watch what happened in the wake of that proof. The conversation about non-English music in the Western mainstream genuinely shifted. The growing editorial support for non-English language music on major Western platforms. You can't draw a straight line from BTS to all of that, but you can absolutely identify a broader cultural shift in what Western audiences were willing to engage with. And BTS was at the leading edge of that shift. For K-pop specifically, the implications are enormous. Groups don't feel the same pressure to produce English content as a primary product. The idea that Korean language music can headline a Western festival, top a Western chart, win Western fans without compromising its linguistic identity, that's a reality now. It wasn't before. And then there's what I think is the most underrated thing BTS built: the proof of concept for a different kind of artist-fan relationship. The way BTS engaged with their fan base, the weverse platform, the V live streams, the direct communication, the sense of genuine intimacy across a language barrier and a cultural divide, was not how Western pop stars operated. It was something new. Something that felt, to millions of people, like actual connection rather than managed celebrity. And that model has now been adopted across the K-pop industry. Every major group now has a fan platform that mirrors what BTS pioneered. The idea that an artist can communicate directly, consistently, vulnerably with their global fan base, and that this creates a loyalty that no amount of traditional marketing can manufacture, that's conventional wisdom in the K-pop industry now. But it wasn't when BTS started doing it. They built it from scratch. They took the parasocial criticism, the "their fans are too obsessed" discourse, the mockery of how seriously ARMY took these online interactions, and they kept building anyway. And now, the entire industry is built on the foundation of that model. So let's pull all of this together, because I want to be precise about what I'm actually saying here. I'm not saying BTS suffered so that other groups could succeed. I'm not framing this as martyrdom, because that's not what it is. BTS has had extraordinary success. They've lived extraordinary lives. The story isn't one of sacrifice. It's one of consequence. What I'm saying is that the getting dragged and the paving the way are not two separate stories. They are the same story. Every time BTS was dismissed, they proved something that made the next dismissal slightly harder to sustain. Every time they were gatekept, they pushed through in a way that widened the gate. Every time the industry tried to contain them, to the K-pop category, to the foreign act designation, to the social media phenomenon framing, they outgrew the container, and the act of outgrowing it made the container larger for everyone who followed. The groups who are thriving in the Western market right now are thriving in conditions that BTS helped create. Not because BTS handed anything over, but because the resistance they encountered, and the way they responded to that resistance, changed the terrain. That's what paving the way actually looks like. It's not a red carpet being rolled out. It's someone walking across gravel, repeatedly, until it becomes a road. And here's the final thing I'll leave you with. A lot of the groups who have benefited from what BTS built will never fully be able to acknowledge it. Not because they're ungrateful, but because the music industry doesn't really work that way. You don't thank your predecessors in press releases. You don't cite your influences in your chart victories. You just perform in the spaces that exist. And sometimes you don't know or think about how those spaces came to exist. But we can know. We can look at the timeline. We can track what the Western K-pop landscape looked like in 2016 and what it looks like now, and ask seriously, what changed, and who changed it first? The answer is pretty clear. So the next time you see BTS getting dragged while some other group is sailing smoothly through a Western press cycle, getting the warm profiles, the festival headlines, the genuine enthusiasm from outlets that once wouldn't have given Korean music the time of day, just remember, the smooth part of the road exists because somebody walked it when it wasn't smooth yet. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.